Normally when someone calls me at 10:30 at night, the temperature is 10 below zero, I jump out of bed, I get pretty angry. Who could be such a bloody fool to do this? But when I found out that it was Bill Bell and what was on his mind, I was not only pleased, I was flattered, and had a great many strong emotions course through me at the moment. Because by a strange bit of coincidence, it was almost 20 years ago to the day that the idea of the Triton was starting to develop. At the time, I and my family had just moved to Rhode Island from the Midwest, and after a couple of false starts, I finally landed a job in a little company called the American Boat Building Corporation in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. And as in most small companies, our duties were comprised about everything from production to sales to advertising to you name it. And one of the jobs which I had was working with Carl Ahlberg, who was the actual naval architect who drew the technical drawings for the Triton. And we were building a little boat at that time called the Sea Sprite, which was a lovely little 22-footer, which is still being built, still very much of a factor. And there was something about this man, Carl Ahlberg, as I got to know him, that impressed me tremendously as to his capabilities as a designer and his ability to design a beautiful boat and an excellently performing boat. I might just mention in passing, probably some of you have read of this, a Sea Sprite was sailed to Europe last fall, a year ago last fall, sailed to France, I believe it was, without incident, except when the Sea Sprite arrived and the owner jumped on the dock and fell and broke his leg. But while in this job, I did a little traveling, and one thing which kind of stimulated the idea of the Triton was the fact that a dealer down in the Chesapeake Bay named George Walton was bringing a wood family sailing boat into the States called the King's Cruiser. It was about 28 feet long. It was designed for family sailing. And he was selling, as I learned, about 30 of these a year. The concept of family cruising existed in Europe long before it really became a popular activity here. The King's Cruiser was an extremely popular boat. There were hundreds of them selling over there, and they were beginning to find a market in this country. So, as I was learning something about fiberglass and was impressed with the material, I really felt, and I still feel, it's the most logical material which exists for the building of a boat, particularly a sailboat. The thought that kept coming to me was if it would be possible to build a family cruising boat, perhaps similar to the King's Cruiser, about that size, that hopefully would be quite successful. I went to the boss of this little company I was with, and he wasn't interested. At that point, I had some sketches, some rough sketches of the boat, indicating somewhat how it should look, what the accommodations might be. So I then went down to New York to Sparkman & Stevens to see if they might have an interest in actually designing it. Of course, they wouldn't give me the time of day. So I then went to Carl Ahlberg and asked Carl if he'd like to design it. And he said he would. And without having any interest on the part of the firm where I was employed at the time, I started to look around to see if we could find someone who could build it. Went to Cape Cod and talked to Les Goodwin, and he wasn't interested. then Carl Ulberg suggested I call on Clint Pearson, who at that time was running a little company in Bristol called Pearson Plastics. And they were making little rowboats and little outboard runabouts. Well, I don't know if any of you know Clint Pearson, but he's quite a fella, and he has great courage and tenacity and excellent business acumen. And he was very interested. So we worked out a deal, and we went to work. By now it was the summer of 1957, and we were aiming to get the first boat built for the January 1958 New York Boat Show. The boat evolved, and the more I looked at it, the more excited I became, because I felt it was an extremely beautiful hull, and I just couldn't feel more excited and positive and confident that we really had something going here. The boat finally went into the water in December. The boat show was starting in January, and we had our first little comeuppance in that when we launched it across the bay, Everett Pearson and I took the boat out for a little trial run, and as we came back to the railway, I thought the boat seemed to be getting a little bit lower in the water. So I took a look down below, and sure enough, there was about 6 inches of water above the floorboards. We got back to the railway, and the owner had left. It was now dark. The temperature was about 25, I guess. So there we were with a sinking boat, and the boat show just around the corner. So it was decided that I would remain on board, which I did. And I crawled back aft, and there was a little hole back in the skeg, and water was shooting out of it. So I put my finger in it. We tied the boat up at the dock, and Everett Pearson got in his car and tore across the bay to another shipbuilder, got a launch, got back just about as the water was, getting up to about here. We finally got the boat about 90% completed. We rented a low bed and a tractor, loaded it the night before the boat show about midnight, and unfortunately the tractor had a defective gear shift, so that every time it came to the slightest incline, it had to shift into low gear. 3 of us climbed into the boat. I think it was Everett Pearson and Clint and myself with our pliers, screwdrivers, wire, paint, saws. We completed the boat en route to New York, arriving at the Coliseum about 7 o'clock the next morning. We displayed the boat, and much to our delight and surprise, it was the hit of the boat show. And as a matter of fact, I sold the first boat to a former classmate of mine, which was sort of nice. We brought the first Triton out, this is going to kill you, I'm sure, and sold it for $8,950 complete. Number 1 boat. The boat really started not only the success of the Pearson Yacht Corporation, which today, as you know, is owned by Grumman Aircraft and is, I believe, the largest and most successful in terms of dollar volume of producer today, but I think it kind of provided the impetus for the whole industry, which took off from that point, and as you probably know, has grown into a fairly substantial activity. That essentially is how the boat evolved. I thought perhaps I could tell you a few incidents which occurred along the way, some of which I wouldn't wish to happen to my worst enemy. The number 2 boat, and I think this is the one that you were, Mr. Dobbin's boat, and I'm pretty sure it was his boat. was sent down to the Annapolis Boat Show, where it was publicized to a great extent by a dealer down there, a good friend of mine named Henry Schufelt. And people came in droves from Washington, from Baltimore, from Wilmington, from all over to see this miracle of technology, this marvelous boat that didn't leak, had dry bilges, etc., etc., etc. When the boat was loaded, the workmen unfortunately tilted it so that it was down at the bow, and for some reason which we today don't understand, put corks in the cockpit drains. The boat ran into a downpour en route to Annapolis, a cloudburst actually, and of course what happened, the water built up into the cockpit, built up to the companionway, and went off into the boat. And the boat arrived, all the people clamored around it to look at this beautiful thing, and Captain Schufelt climbed up on the truck and proudly opened the hatch and looked inside, and lo and behold, there was 5 feet of water, all the mattresses floating around, water dripping out of the light bulbs. The telephone started ringing very shortly after that. I got quite a lecture. Another thing that happened, and I want to assure you that many of the things that happened in those early days are problems that we solved. But when we started to make our own rigging, we made the mistake of buying a sledging machine, which is a machine which secures the true lock, the metal piece, to the actual rigging. And what we didn't know was that when you bought this particular type of sledging equipment, you had to buy a particular matching type of true lock, or else it didn't work. So we made all this rigging, put it on the boats. And one day I was in the office and my phone rang, and this voice said, "Tom?" I said, "Yeah." "This is so-and-so." I said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, we really like your Triton. Had a great sale, but we had a little problem." I said, "Oh, what was that?" He said, "Well, we were sailing into Larchmont, and the wind was blowing about 25 knots, and all the people were out on the dock watching us and admiring us." He said, "All of a sudden, everything went boom, overboard." We had about 80 boats out that spring with this rigging. We weren't sure where they were or who owned them, but we got on the telephone and we called up every single owner. We were up day and night doing this and explained the problem to them, and we replaced all the rigging. We had another experience with the Woolsey people who made the paint we were buying. At that time, and even today, there's a great lack of knowledge about the compatibility or incompatibility of many of the chemicals and so forth that go into the paint and into the resin that bake the boat. So we put this particular type of Woolsey bottom paint on about 80 or 90 boats, and all of a sudden one of them started to erupt into little pinhead blisters, thousands of these things all over the bottom of the boat. We called up Woolsey, and I will say to their credit, as you can imagine, the telephone started ringing again from customers all over the country who were getting these boats with these little things popping out over the bottom. And it was a chemical problem of some sort. But Woolsey made good. They paid for having all of the boats scraped, repainted with the proper paint. One boat, actually this little incident happened twice, but one boat we sent out to Seattle, Washington, also didn't exactly endear us to our dealer out there. The boat while it was being built, this dealer also had issued a great deal of publicity, and a lot of people arrived on hand to see this marvelous bit of technology. And this particular boat, when it was being built, one day one of the fiberglass men who was working in the bilge had to leave, and he was having lunch inside the boat. So when he left, he put his ham sandwich down in the bilge. And the fellow who followed him didn't see it. Fiberglass right over the ham sandwich. And when the boat arrived in Seattle, Washington, and the dealer lifted up the floorboards, there was this beautiful ham sandwich encased in this translucent fiberglass. We also had a boat where this was done with a cigar, too. So we had our problems. As a matter of possible interest, in the fall of 1958, we had this. This was really turned out to be one of the best bits of publicity we ever had. But in the fall of 1958, we had quite a bad hurricane, and the next morning, Bristol Harbor was a mass of splinters and smashed boats. There wasn't a boat in the harbor, with one exception, that was in one piece. And there was a Triton that was tied up at a mooring during this hurricane, and it broke loose. And I don't know if you're familiar with Bristol Harbor or not, but there's a seawall that runs for about 3/4 of a mile down the shore, and the Triton hit the seawall and pounded down the seawall all the way from the upper to the lower end of the harbor. It must have gone 3/4 of a mile hitting the seawall. And when it came to rest outside of the rudder, which of course was smashed, and the aft part of the keel, the skeg, which in the early boats was a separate piece, as perhaps some of you know, was smashed. But beyond that, and except for a lot of abrasions on the hull, scratches and so forth, this is the only damage, except for water, of course, inside the boat, that was done to the hull. And we called up Owens Corning, and they had their photographers down there, and about the next day, taking photographs and writing releases and so forth. And it was a great plug for the material. The esprit de corps of the Triton Association is really something. I, in the past, have gotten to know some of the members of the Long Island Association, and one summer we were cruising in a Vanguard, and we came into Stillington Harbor, and there were about 20 Tritons, I would say, rafted up. And I knew several of the owners, and they very nicely invited us to come tie up alongside in our Vanguard, which we did, and we partook of the refreshments, and we're all enjoying ourselves until about 10 o'clock at night, and I looked up and I suddenly realized that we were adrift. We were drifting away from the group, and apparently one of the Triton owners was so affronted at having a non-Triton boat tie up alongside that he cut our lines just to shut us off. We've had 3 Tritons ourselves, and we enjoyed them tremendously. I was talking to Clint Pearson the other day about some business matters, and we both feel that if that mold were available today, and it's not, that it would, in our opinion, would be a good selling boat, because there's been a return after all of these IOR designs that have come out over the past several years, these racing machines and so on. There's been a kind of a rebellion, I think, against these extreme designs, and more really bona fide cruising boats are being built. And I think the Triton will if it were being built today, would do very well. And I think the proof of that lies in the fact that after 20 years, here's a boat which is still very actively used and well known, and has been a good investment, as I understand it. Well, that's about the story of how the Triton evolved and a few of the problems we had while building it. I don't know if you have any questions that I could answer about the boat. I'd be glad to try if you do. Yes, sir.
I hear that I'm a new Triton owner, and I hear that the Triton was built initially over safe. Is that true? I mean, not over safe, but
well, I know.
Built with additional strength that's not in boat today. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Well, I think the fact of the matter is that I was mentioning this to Bill earlier, that Clint Pearson. Well, let me go back one step further. I went to a symposium for naval architects down in Annapolis a year ago last fall, and they had a big talk on fiberglass construction, and the consensus was, when they all got through, that really no one knew the real answers to this material. You've got all kinds of scantlings that have been developed, like Gibbs and Cox have their scantlings, and Owens Corning have their scantlings. A lot of naval architects have their own theories about it. I think in the case of boats that Clint Pearson built, I think Clint has always leaned on the safe side and has, if you will, overbuilt the boats to an extent, the hulls. He still does that today with his Bristol Yacht Company. But boats seem to stand up, and as there are still, I think, some unknowns about this material, why not lean on the right side? I've heard some terrible stories about some of these boats that have been built, what happens to them. Practically put your finger through some of them.
But there has been a change in the Triton through the years, has there?
Well, I think so. I left Pearson Yachts in 1967, and at that time we were still building the Triton, but Clint Pearson had also left, and the Grumman people were sending their so-called experts down. And I think perhaps if there was a change in the hull structure that had occurred at that time, they may have tried some new ideas.
When you showed the first Triton at the first boat show, was it the only fiberglass boat in the show?
No, there was one other called, I think it was built out in Cleveland. Gosh, I can't think of the name of it.
Ray Green's boat?
Yeah, Ray Green's boat, right.
Well, was that the first year for fiberglass?
No, it wasn't. It was the first year, I would say, for a fiberglass boat that was was designed to be built and sold in any real volume or production. Now, Ray Green had a fiberglass boat. It was designed by Sparkman Stevens, as a matter of fact.
Is that the Tartan?
No, not the Tartan. I just can't think of the name.
That was a 25-footer.
I think she was a little bigger. I think she was around 27, 28, but she wasn't very pretty.
Yeah.
And
Didn't they build Tritons on the West Coast, too?
yes, we did.
How many hulls altogether?
On the West Coast,
Altogether, East Coast and
I'm not sure of the exact number. My understanding it was something under 800, late 700, 780, 790, something like that. Yes, they did. They built them on the West Coast, and we found it was still cheaper to build them in Bristol and ship them after our experience out there. As a matter of fact, one rather interesting thing happened out there. We were building the Allberg 35, and the mold was getting kind of worn, so we scrapped it. And we instructed the man at the junkyard where we took it to burn it and get rid of it, which he didn't do. And some very enterprising young man came along and bought the mold for $25 and fixed it up and started the Erickson Yacht Company. You know,
This was the Triton mold?
no, this was the Auberg
What
35.
happened to the Triton mold?
They were, Grumman destroyed them. Because, see, when Bill Shaw became general manager, all the design work was turned over to Bill Shaw, who was a naval architect.
Right, yeah.
And they wanted to stop paying Carl Auberg royalties. Carl Auberg did quite well on his designs, very
So
well.
was that the end of making Tritons? At that
Yes,
point?
yes, it was.
For that reason?
Yes, basically that's right. See, there was none of us had any conception that the business would go like it did, and that we would sell not only the Tritons, the ensigns. We were turning out ensigns 2 a day, like automobiles. And none of us, in our wildest dreams, ever thought the thing would go like this. And Grumman got tired of paying Carl Auberg all these royalties. So anyway, they turned the designs over to Bill Shaw, and that was the end of the Triton.
How about that keel change, which I think occurred somewhere near hole number 300? What was behind that? You had a 2-piece keel, as you said, in the early boats. Later,
Yeah.
you had a single piece.
I'm trying to remember why we did it that way, and I don't recall. I really don't. But my recollection is that they went to a 1-piece keel.
Yeah, they did.
I think there was a problem with the design, the shape of the design. You've got to be awfully careful when you design these boats, and you don't design them so that you lock the boat in the mold.
Yeah.
And I think possibly the design of the aft end of that keel may have been such that it locked, so they had to do it separately and tack it on afterwards. Then they redesigned it a little bit.
Was the Triton a 2-piece mold?
The Triton was a 1-piece mold.
One piece?
Yeah. Well, deck was one mold, and the hull. The hull was a 1-piece
It wasn't a
mold.
split mold?
No, no. Oh, yeah. There's a picture, there's one picture here that I think is a marvelous, I'll just leave it on the table here if you'd like to look at it. A marvelous picture of the Triton. I don't know if you can see this or not. This was done by the Saturday Evening Post. I think it was in 1962. They did an article on fiberglass sailboats, as I recall, and they very kindly sent me a print, and Clint and Everett Pearson, I think, a print of this Triton. It was taken down in Florida someplace. I think it was taken from a helicopter, but it really kind of captures the appearance of the boat and the feel of sailing. And for the ladies, you might be interested in this needlepoint. My mother did.
And you point
Of a Triton. Yeah, it was done from a photograph.
No number.
Oh, this little, it was rather a
Not
little.
buy in a store at the pit, can you?
She had it designed in the needlepoint, I forget the name of it, Guild in Boston. They did it from a photograph that some friends of ours took.
Photograph and they
Yes.
do it for you.
Yeah.
They painted, I guess
They
they
did the
painted
painting.
on it, don't they? Painted on much of a needlepoint in
Yeah.
myself. We had a rather funny run-in with Merriman, the fittings people, when we were getting started. You notice the insignia here is very close to Merriman's. We got a call from their legal department and said we couldn't use a Trident. And I said, well, it isn't a Trident. He said, what is it? I said, it's a Dudent. It's only got 2 prongs. So that was the end of that.
That caused me a lot of trouble.
Yeah. Oh.
Our first advertising went out,
I
and
don't think
it did have a
it's,
Triton.
I was hoping you wouldn't remember that.
And because of that, Ted Hood had the first advertising. And I ordered my set of sails from Hood, and it came back with
The Trident.
the Trident. And I called up Ted and I said, hey, what the hell's wrong with you?
oh, quite
Student.
And he sent me a copy of your first advertisement. He said, well, that's what I used. And there it was.
Well, you're right. That was a painting, the first ad. The fellow had a Triton on the thing. We also had a little run-in with Walter Cronkite's publicity man. The telephone rang one night after one of those days. He wished it never had happened. And phone rang, and this fellow wanted to know if a sales manager was around. And I said, yeah, you're talking to him. He said, well, I'm suing you for, what, $500,000. I said, oh? He said, yeah, you mentioned the fact in one of your releases that Walter Cronkite owns a Triton, which we did. We sent out little releases now and then. We just thought it was, might be of interest to people to know that Walter Cronkite had bought a Triton, and his agent called up and was going to sue us for using his name. So I didn't sleep very well that night. The next morning I called up Walter Cronkite myself, told him what had happened. Said, oh, I said, forget about him. No paying any attention to him. He's just a little overzealous. He was very nice about it. Yeah, new Triton.
This being a new type of construction, were there some difficult things to surmount in the initial plantings and organizing of the construction?
Well, the old saying of the blind leading the blind? That was about it. We did have some pretty good advice from a fellow named Tony Cobb, who worked for Owens Corning. He came down and helped us. But it really was kind of trial and error to begin with, because no one knew anything about it, really.
Whose resins were you using?
At that time,
Yeah.
gee, I don't recall. That was 20 years ago. I
What
don't
about
remember.
something about when you put the sails up for the very first time and sailed for the very first time? What were your thoughts? Were you
Well, we were impressed with the way the boat sailed. As a matter of fact, I had one of the early Tritons when they were just going out, and I took the boat out into the bay one day down near Newport, and gosh, I was amazed. Well, that boat was, because there were no fiberglass boats, at that time, and we seemed to be going by all the old wood boats, just going right by. I'm like, we won some races around the island or something.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Well, the wood boats were awfully mad at us.
Yeah.
When the first Triton came out, was the main go all the way up, was it always a 7/8 rig in the beginning?
It was until one year I bought a Triton and decided to experiment with a masthead rig. So I had the boat rigged with a mast that was 4 feet shorter, and the boom was 2 feet longer, as I recall, and we eliminated the jumper struts and ran the headstay up to the top of the mast. And the people on the West Coast liked it so much that they started to insist on having all the West Coast Tritons delivered as masthead rigs. But the original design was a 7/8. Most of the boats. I beg your pardon?
On the East Coast, but on the West Coast they didn't.
On the West Coast, they were masthead, right.
How many yawls were
Oh, I remember perhaps, I'd say maybe half a dozen, maybe. Yeah. It gets kind of cluttered when you get that mizzen mast back there.
I've only seen one in all the years. One.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen one?
Yeah, it's in Bristol. Number 50.
Is that?
That's number 50. Number 50, right?
Campbell. Bill Campbell.
I don't know whether the name Peter Katzenbach means that.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yes, I
He
know.
told, I went down there to pester him. I've been down there numerous times to pester him on all the picayune stuff like screens and so forth, and reluctantly you'll go back to the back room and, you'll get it out and charge you top dollar. So I happened to ask him one day, will you build Tritons? Will anybody build a Triton anymore? He said, yeah, if we get an order for 6 boats. You say the mold is destroyed.
Well, I thought it was. I could be wrong, but
According to
Maybe
Peter,
put it in the dump.
according to Peter
Well, I'd like to get hold of
Kassenbach,
it.
he says if he gets a firm order for 6 boats, he'll
He's not
he'll
down
do
there.
so. Now, Peter doesn't call the shots. He's what, customer relations manager or something he was.
I don't
No
know.
more.
Yeah,
What
what's
is
it?
he now?
Warranty, handles the warranty.
Same canoe. That's what,
Doesn't he handle the warranty problems or something like that?
I don't know, he's some customer
did,
relationship
yes.
manager or something last time I was down there.
Well, maybe they do have it. I thought they'd gotten rid of it.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about,
I'd love to get hold of that mold myself.
yeah, boy. Let me ask you a question. What would you figure at today's prices it would cost to manufacture Triton?
Including
In
the
other words,
tool.
you mentioned 8,900 back in, when was it, 1957?
1958. Yeah, it's
1958?
57, 58 we were building it, yeah. Including the tooling or just the hull? Just
Well, the
boat proper?
basic boat with working sails, like you used to say back in 1957. What would you say a dollar figure would be today? Today's prices?
Yeah, I'm thinking here. Well, I would guess 18, 19,000.
At least.
Well, you know, I had my boat surveyed for insurance, and very interestingly, they list the insured value, they list the sale value, and then they list this thing called replacement value. He had that down at $22,000. And I said, what the hell is that figure? And he said that if we built a boat like that today, that's what it would cost.
Did that?
Let's go to him, claim it's 30,000.
Yeah, I can believe it. We have a young lady who works for John Alden here. You probably have some ideas on that. Yeah.
You know, I've read through a boat.
No, we do have two on the market now that are up for 12. 2 years old. Remember, when we put on 12,000 for our insurance, when we first was starting out, we was it was too much. I know, I don't think so, but we couldn't replace anything that was done too, but think about it.
No, I was one of the people, because I had my insured 10,
Yeah,
and then I was
We have
thinking of selling the
701
boat,
and you
and I
have
was
what,
told I
100?
could get 15.
yeah.
There's one for sale in Newport for 15,
How old?
400 or something.
Doesn't
Well,
matter.
that's low. You should see the prices down at Chesapeake. They're very active down at Chesapeake Bay. They go anywhere from the very, very low is like 13.5 up to 18.5, depending on equipment.
Oh.
Really?
We weren't aware of all that when we first, started discussing it. It's interesting to hear.
I think what I've heard that most people who have had fiberglass boats of any kind of a reputation have had a good investment over the last 4 or 5 years. Some of the stories I've heard about the appreciation in value of the Hinckley boats are just unbelievable. You know, they had 60 or 70,000 in them, and now they're worth 90, 100.
Glass.
Fiberglass, yeah,
Look what happened to West End when it started out.
yeah.
The price is almost doubled.
Has it really?
It's
Has
almost
it?
doubled. You think the call and everything, all the equipment.
Yeah, of course, resin is a petroleum byproduct. Resin.
Oh, 3 years ago, they were $10,000 less than they are now.
Is that a fact? Okay.
Can you tell me what is the advantage of a 7/8 rig versus a full head, full rig?
I don't know really. You've got a little higher aspect ratio, which is supposedly theoretically gives you a more efficient mainsail, narrower, taller main.
Yeah.
When we had our masthead rig Triton, we took it out and sailed it against some 7/8, and we couldn't really tell any difference.
You couldn't tell any difference.
as far as the performance went.
Did you experiment with putting a masthead rig on your 36-foot mast?
The masthead rig on our 36-foot. I don't think I understand.
You've got a 36
Oh, you mean on the regular Triton size mast?
Right, that's your stock.
Well, actually, we got Allberg to design the final masthead rig that was used on the West Coast, and his the masthead rig which he designed was longer than the experimental one I have on my own boat by I think 2 feet, which would have made it 2 feet, just 2 feet shorter than the
Stock.
right.
Yeah.
And I think you get into a situation of where rating starts to, you would be increasing your sail area. You start maybe doing something to the rating that you shouldn't. You may hamper its capabilities when it's blowing hard. And the West Coast, particularly up around San Francisco, it blows pretty hard out there.
So also you, in your original masts were extruded out of a lesser gauge than the subsequent mast, if I remember correctly.
It was a different alloy. I don't recall.
But,
Yeah.
It was a different alloy, but I guess
60.
you didn't increase the gauge. It did increase the gauge.
Could be. I don't recall. They increased the thickness, wall thickness of it.
Yeah.
Well, I think so. You look at the early boats, a couple around the yard, I think it's at least Ken Napkin, that somewhere around 300.
Well, we had some problems there for a while with the original spar, and we had to send out some extra rigging,
Lower case, right?
lowers,
Forward
lowers, right, because the mast was whipping too much, and
Insurance companies got tired of paying for price.
yeah. Well, there's a lot of things people don't know in this area. You probably read in the paper about 6 weeks ago where Ted Hood lost his spar on his 12-meter up in Marblehead. He was the greatest designer of spars in the country, so supposedly.
That's what Ted said.
If you look at the new spars, the weight aloft is acceptably heavy.
Yeah,
300, I guess, is roughly the line.
yeah. My recollection was they increased the forward and aft length on that spar
Yes, I think so.
to eliminate the whip in it.
And weren't the earliest ones tapered at the very top
I believe so.
section?
Yeah, they were.
And the later ones went straight on up.
Yeah.
Were there any boats made that were keel step? They all deck step.
They were all deck step. That's the only way you could really get the room in the boat that we were after. The deck stepping and running the head right across the boat is something. Most boats before the Triton, you perhaps recall, the galley always used to be up sort of amidships. Remember, in most boats? And the head was a little place on one side. And
Well, the King's Cruise you talked about, I was looking at one really seriously one time. There was no petitioning out in some of the
no petitioning.
4 bunks and a head, right?
All together. Yeah.
Together.
Well, she was only, 28 feet, wasn't she? And
Narrow.
very narrow, yeah.
And very light, and very tender.
Very, yeah. Iron keel, I think, as I recall. But in its day, it was a very popular boat. It sold a lot.
For those of us who are getting nervous about aged motors, would you, when the time does come that you have to repower, would you consider some of the 2-cycle diesels that are being talked about now, or would you just stay with the good old Atomic 4? Have any thoughts there?
Well, not really, except that I'm doing some work for Bristol Yachts now, and we were discussing the relative merits of the Atomic 4 and the Westerby, their small diesel, and as I understand it, the price of the Universal and the diesel are getting quite close.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we used to buy Universal for $800. And the diesels used to run 2,000 or 3,000.
Sure.
And now they're getting close, so that if you could get one that would fit, this is always a problem because the diesels, as you know, are quite a bit higher. Might not be a bad idea.
We have a member with a 2-cylinder diesel. I remember talking. I think it might be Mr. Enderer, though. Someone new member.
Tritons have been repowered with both the Farrington, the small Farrington diesel, and also the Volvo MD2. As I went up to buy some replacement parts for my fuel pump, I was talking to a fellow named Hanson in Market, a marine engine repair shop. He confirmed what I found out earlier on the phone, that Westerbeek is no longer handling the accounting for distributors. They'll sell out their existing stock of parts, but they're not handling them because, I guess, the ostensible reason, I guess, is that Westerbeek, the Universal has now come up with a diesel engine in their line, 16 Universal diesels.
I didn't know that.
Competitive with the Westerbeek, whatever. But the really interesting part of the story was that Hanson indicated that
On Atomic 4 yet. I haven't heard of it. I expect it could happen. But,
Marvelous little engine.
yeah, it wants to go.
Yours is still ticking away, isn't it, Bill?
Sure. Bingity, bingity, bing. Oh, yeah.
Same original engine?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But he's
But you say it, you don't know.
Oh, yeah. I put 110 hours on the engine this past summer. Oh, yeah. Sure. Have a little engine hour meter. And ran 110 hours. I did a valve job on it a couple of years ago. But.
We had this boat building in France one year. We had a Triton. A Frenchman came over and I think he built about 5 or 6, and that was the last we heard of him.
A French-built Triton?
Yeah, built in France.
Oh.
Yeah, for the French market.
Well, there's something that Triton people ought to know about. Huh?
How do you get the mold? You make the mold himself, or?
He bought a boat, and he made a mold from the boat. And I think there was a slight problem in collecting royalties from him.
Carl has some words on that. Was the molded in non-skid deck right from the original?
You don't mind if I sit down?
No, please do.
What's the what?
The non-skid detail molded into the deck right from Triton number 1.
Yeah.
That was good. That's good footing. Whoever designed that was know what they're doing. Good. Well, it is about 10:30, and I think we're about due to close up with many, many thanks to our good guest, Mr. Potter. Mrs. Potter. Thank you for making the meeting possible. Very, very kind of you.
For having us.
And I apologize for having called you so late that night. I didn't mean to. Well, I would guess we are adjourned until March 2nd or 3rd or whatever we come up with. See that you're notified.